Get your daughter off that velvet chair, Thomas. People are paying $10,000 a plate tonight, and cheap crayons don't exactly fit the brand of this. Evening. Julian Mercer did not look down when he spoke. He stood with his hands tucked into the pockets of a tailored wool trousers, his posture rigid and unyielding, smelling of expensive sandalwood cologne and the slightly burnt aroma of the team, double espresso he had been nursing for the last hour. He was the banquet director of the Hope Memorial Pediatric Wing fundraiser, a man whose entire professional existence was built on the careful curation of appearances. To him, the grand ballroom of the hospital's historic wing was a stage, and every element had to be perfectly controlled. Thomas Miller did not stop his work. He was high up on an aluminum ladder, his calloused fingers pulling a thick, copper audio cable through a narrow brass conduit behind a massive Corinthian column. His forehead was slick with sweat, the dust of the old building's plaster clinging to the damp skin of his neck. He wore a faded navy work shirt, its sleeves rolled up to reveal thick, scarred forearms and a canvas tool belt that clinked with every slight adjustment of his weight. "She's not touching the velvet, sir," Thomas said. His voice was low, flat, carrying the quiet, heavy weight of a rock. "She's sitting on her coat." Mercer's jaw tightened. A micro-expression of irritation flashed across his face, his nostrils flaring slightly as he looked toward the service corridor. Maya, Thomas's 7-year-old daughter, sat on a folding chair near the service entrance. She had folded her worn, hand-me-down winter coat over the plush fabric of the chair to create a protective barrier. She was wearing a faded blue cardigan with slightly frayed cuffs, her small knees pulled up as she focused on an old composition notebook on her lap. She was drawing a diagram of a human tower heart with a green crayon, her small fingers moving with a quiet, solemn intensity that made her look far older than her years. "I don't care about the coat, Thomas," Mercer said, his voice dropping to a sharp, hushed whisper as several early-arriving donors in tuxedos walked past the main entrance. "The point is, she shouldn't be here. This isn't a daycare. This is a $5 million charity event. If the Board of Trustees sees a child sitting by the service doors, it looks unprofessional. It looks like we can't manage our own staff." A young waiter in a starched white shirt walked past, carrying a silver tray of teeple, empty champagne flutes. He looked at Thomas, then at Maya, then quickly averted, his eyes, his face going completely blank. It was an ingrained, everyday reaction in this building, the silent agreement to ignore those who did the penria, actual work, to treat them as part of the architecture, necessary but invisible. Thomas pulled the cable tight, secured it with a heavy zip tie, and began his descent down the ladder. Every step was deliberate. His work boots, scuffed and stained with grease from a dozen different boiler rooms, made a heavy, rhythmic sound against the polished parquet floor. He stood a full 3 inches taller than Mercer, his presence grounded and heavy, but he kept his shoulders slightly rounded, a physical habit developed over years of trying not to occupy too much space in rooms where his presence was tolerated but not welcomed. "Her after-school program closed early today," Thomas said, looking Mercer directly in the eye. His eyes were tired, shadowed by years of sleepless nights, but they were steady. "I had no one else to watch her. She won't be in the way. She'll stay right there until I'm finished with the audio feed." Mercer let out a short, dry laugh, a sound that carried no warmth. He checked his gold watch, then adjusted the cuffs of his shirt. "You have 20 minutes, Thomas. If she is still here when the main doors open, I'm calling the agency. We'll find another technician who can manage his family life without bringing it onto our floor." He turned on his heel and walked away, his polished leather shoes clicking any day, sharply against the marble threshold. Thomas stood by the base of the ladder, his hand resting on the metal frame. He closed his eyes and counted his breaths. 4 in, 4 out, the deep-seated, slow rhythm of a man who had learned to survive the worst days of his life by refusing to let the world see him shake. Behind him, Maya did not look up from her notebook. She had heard every word, but she did not cry. She simply pressed her green crayon a little harder against the paper, filling in the right ventricle of her hand-drawn heart until the wax was thick and dark. The alarm in the small two-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport had gone off at 5 a.m. The room had been freezing, the old steam radiator in the corner clanking and hissing with a violent, metallic urgency that never quite managed to warm the placely, drafty space. The air smelled of cold grease, old plaster, and the faint, sweet scent of the lavender laundry detergent Thomas bought because it was the only brand that didn't irritate Maya's sensitive skin. Thomas had sat on the edge of his mattress, his work boots already laced, his hands resting on his knees. His apartment was clean, minimal, almost sterile. There were no trophies on the shelves, no framed diplomas, no flashy reminders of his past. The only thing that mattered in the entire three-room flat sat on the kitchen counter, next to a half-empty box of oatmeal and a plastic lunchbox with a faded cartoon sticker. It was a small black leather notebook, its corners worn down to the gray cardboard underneath, the spine held together by several layers of black electrical tape. On the first page, in neat, slanted handwriting that had begun to fade over the last 4 years, were the words, "To my Thomas, for when the placed noise gets too loud, remember how the heart sings." It was Sarah's book. Sarah, his late wife, had been an emergency room nurse at Bridgeport General. She had been the one who convinced him, after his second tour as a combat paramedic in the dry, dusty heat of Helmand Province, that his hands were too good to be wasted on mechanical work. She had watched him in their kitchen, using a pair of needle-nose pliers to extract a tiny broken pin from a kitchen mixer with the same absolute precision he had used to clamp a bleeding femoral artery in a dark, sand-swept medical tent, and she had told him, "You have the gift, Thomas, the kind you don't get from books." He had tried to believe her. He had enrolled in the paramedic transition program, spent his nights studying cardiovascular physiology by the light of a single bulb while Maya slept in the next room, his mind cataloging the electrical pathways of the human heart with the same ease other men used to memorize sports statistics. Then Sarah had found the lump. It had been an aggressive, fast-moving form of cancer that didn't care about his crust, plans, or her dreams. Thomas had spent 6 months watching her disappear, sitting in hard plastic hospital chairs, listening to specialists in white coats deliver complicated, polite explanations about treatment protocols and survival rates. During her final week, Thomas had noticed a subtle change in her breathing, a WAN-ADM, tiny, irregular catch at the end of each exhalation, a microscopic shift in her heart rate that didn't register on the standard bedside monitors. He had mentioned it to her attending physician, a man with 3 degrees from Ivy League universities and a reputation that filled the hospital corridors with quiet deference. The physician had smiled, a gentle, patronizing expression, and told Thomas that his military medical experience was admirable, but that the hospital's electronic monitoring systems were state-of-the-art, and that Sarah's vitals were within normal therapeutic margins. Thomas had stayed quiet. He had deferred to the experts. He had told himself that his own fear was making him see things that weren't there, that his combat training didn't translate to the highly specialized, structured world of a modern oncology ward. Sarah had died of a preventable cardiac arrest 3 days later, while the bedside monitor was still displaying green, normal indicators. After her funeral, Thomas had packed up his books, his stethoscope, and his paramedic shears. He had locked them in a green metal footlocker in the basement and taken the first job he could find that didn't involve people, didn't involve medicine, and didn't involve the terrible, load-bearing weight of deciding whether someone lived or died. He had become an HVAC technician. He spent his days in crawl spaces and boiler rooms, surrounded by copper pipes, electrical, wires, and the simple, predictable logic of machines. If a machine was broken, you replaced the part. It didn't cry. It didn't leave an empty room. The only thing he kept was Sarah's notebook. He touched it now, his thumb running over the worn leather of the cover. I could still smell the faint aroma of the cocoa butter she used to rub into her dry hands after a 12-hour shift. The memory was bone deep, an everyday ache that he carried with him into every boiler room and every drafty corridor. "Daddy?" Maya was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, her hair uncombed, her eyes small with sleep. She was clutching her coloring book against her chest. "Oatmeal's ready, baby," Thomas said, his voice instantly softening as he slid the black notebook into his breast pocket. "Eat up. We have a long day." By 6:45 p.m., the grand ballroom of Hope Memorial Hospital was filled with the low, continuous murmur of wealth. The air was thick with the scent of expensive French perfumes, aged red wine, and the crisp, clean smell of freshly pressed linen. Donors moved between tables, their laughter light and comfortable, the kind of laughter that comes from people who have never had to wonder if they could afford their next prescription or if their heating would be turned off in February. Thomas stood on the service balcony above the main floor, his hand resting on the brass railing. From this height, the guests looked like figures in a store window, moving with a synchronized, elegant precision that felt entirely foreign to him. He watched Catherine Vance walk into the room. She was flanked by 2 hospital board members, her posture immaculate, her dark hair pulled back tight. She didn't look like the other wealthy women in the wealthy room. She didn't wear diamonds or flashy colors. She wore a simple charcoal silk dress that fit her with the precision of a military uniform, and her eyes, sharp and dark, scanned the room with the quiet, assessing focus of a general surveying a battlefield. She was the founder of Vance Capital, a woman who managed more money than the annual budget of the entire state of Delaware, and she was here tonight because her foundation was funding the hospital's new pediatric unit. Beside her walked Leo, her 8-year-old son. He was a small boy, thin, with his mother's dark eyes, wearing a miniature navy blazer that looked too stiff for his frame. Thomas watched the boy. His combat paramedic instincts, the ones he had spent years trying to put to sleep, flared instantly. Leo was walking with a slight, irregular stiffness. It wasn't a limp, but a subtle guarding of his torso, his shoulders slightly rounded, his chin tucked down toward his chest. As they crossed the floor, Leo reached up with his right hand and tugged at the collar of his shirt. It was an ordinary movement, the kind a mother would dismiss as restlessness. But Thomas noticed the boy's chest. The breathing was shallow, rapid, the sternum rising and falling with a faint, asymmetric lag on the right side. "He's guarding his ribs," Thomas muttered to himself. He looked at his hands, still resting on the brass railing. They were steady. He forced his eyes away, looked at the orchestra tuning their instruments, looked at the banquet manager Mercer, adjusting a floral arrangement at the head table. "It's not your business, Thomas," he told himself. "You're the audio guy. You fix the hum. You go home." He looked back toward the service entrance. Maya was still sitting in her chair, her notebook open, her green crayon moving across the page. She had drawn the outline of a child's ribs. Her lines shaky, but anatomically correct. She looked up, caught his eye, and gave him a small, teachy nod. She was his anchor. Thomas walked down the service stairs, his tools clinking against his thigh, his head down, his gray work shirt a dull contrast to the black-tie guests who moved around him like water around a stone. He had 5 more cables to secure before the main speech began. He would do his job, collect his check, and take his daughter home to their cold apartment, where the only thing they had to manage was the clanking of the radiator. He didn't know that the wind was already changing. The high-pitched, unbroken tone of the cardiac monitor did not wave or bounce. It cut through the sterile air of room 408 like a cold steel blade. On the screen, the green line was flat, a horizontal desert of static that offered no blank, hope, no rhythm, no second chances. Dr. Charles Henderson stepped back from the bedside, his shoulders dropping by a fraction of an inch as he looked down at his gloved hands. His forehead was beaded with sweat, the bright white glare of the overhead surgical-grade lights reflecting off his damp skin. He was a man whose entire career had been defined by successful outcomes, by a deep-seated belief that his expertise and the 40-in-place advanced technology of Hope Memorial Hospital could outnegotiate death itself. But right now, his hands were empty. Beside him, Dr. Sarah Lynn, the pediatric cardiology fellow, slowly lowered the grande syringe she had been holding. Her knuckles were white, her jaw locked in a tight, silent line of defeat. She didn't look at Dr. Henderson, nor did she look at the woman on her knees. Catherine Vance was on her knees on the cold linoleum, her immaculate charcoal, silk dress wrinkled, the hem damp with spilled sterile saline. She was clutching Leo's small, limp, and dangerously cold hand. Her thumb ran over his knuckles in a rapid, desperate circle, as if she could physically rub life back into his veins. Her breathing was shallow, a ragged gasp that caught in her throat every time the monitor let out another second of its relentless, high-pitched scream. "We have to stop, Catherine," Dr. Henderson said, his voice dropping to that hushed, practiced tone of a man delivering a verdict. "We've run the full protocol. 3 doses of epinephrine. Airway is clear. The heart is simply not responding." The room smelled of rubbing alcohol, burnt ozone from the defibrillator paddles, and the heavy, stagnant aroma of defeat. Beyond the glass panel of the intensive care unit, in the dim, quiet corridor, Thomas Miller stood motionless. His navy work shirt was damp, the canvas tool belt still hanging low on his hip, the metal tools clinking softly with every slight shift of his weight. Maya was next to him, sitting on the vinyl floor, her back pressed against the wall. She had her coloring book closed now, her small hands holding her green crayon like a weapon, her eyes fixed on her father's face. Thomas looked through the glass. He didn't look at the doctors. He didn't look at the crying billionaire mother. His eyes were locked on the monitor. Specific, subtle way the flatline had arrived. He had seen this exact stillness before, under a different sky, in a different uniform, and he knew that the silence in that room was not the end. It was simply the wrong answer. But the flatline was not the beginning. To find the root of the fracture, the root timeline must slide backward, past the sterile white walls of room 408, past the panic in the elevators, back to the warm, golden light of the grand ballroom at 2:11 p.m. The charity gala was at its peak. The room was awash of elegant movement, the tane, rustle of silk dresses, the clink of crystal flutes, the heavy, sweet scent, gardenia, and expensive lavender perfume. Guests moved in synchronized patterns, a structured, cultural ritual of charity, where the act of giving was secondary to the act of being seen. Near the main entrance, a slight bottleneck had formed as a prominent local politician, Arthur Pendleton, arrived with his entourage. Pendleton was a heavy-set man with a loud, booming laugh that rattled the hollow stems of the champagne glasses nearby. He moved with the unthinking confidence of a man who believed the space around him was his by right of birth. Leosh Vance, 8 years old, was standing 3 feet from the entrance, his fingers still tugging restlessly at his stiff collar. He was looking toward the back-end dessert table, completely unaware of the movement behind him. Arthur Pendleton, laughing at a joke, stepped backward to make room for an Anakate, arriving socialite. His movement was sudden, heavy. His shoulder caught Leo's shoulder, throwing the boy off balance. As Pendleton scrambled to regain his footing, his heavy platinum cufflink cast in the shape of a signet ring, struck Leo directly in the center of his chest, right over the sternum. The sound was a dull, quiet thump, almost entirely lost beneath the string. Quartet's rendition of a Mozart divertimento. Thomas Miller, high on his ladder, adjusting the treble levels on the rear speaker column, heard it. To a man who had spent 2 years in combat tents, listening for the specific, dry snap of a bone or the wet rattle of a punctured lung, that thump carried a distinct, terrifying resonance. It was the sound of a hollow chamber taking a blunt, localized impact. Leo gasped, his small hand instantly flying to his chest. His eyes went wide, his mouth opening in a silent intake of air. Catherine Vance turned, her hand automatically reaching for her son's shoulder. "Leo? What is it?" "Nothing, Mom," the boy whispered, his voice thin, his hands slowly dropping from his chest as he tried to stand straighter. "Just bumped my chest. I'm okay." Catherine looked up, her attention immediately caught by a hospital board member, who was calling her name. She patted Leo's shoulder, her eyes already moving, past him to the next conversation, the next check, the next face. "All right, sweetheart, just stay close." High on the ladder, Thomas's heart spiked. His hand gripped the metal rung, his knuckles turning white under the grease. Commotio cordis. The words rose in his mind, not as a memory from a textbook, but as a memory. Voice, Captain Davis's voice. Rough and dry as desert sand, echoing in a humid classroom. If the blow lands in that 20-millisecond window when the T-wave is rising, the heart doesn't stop because it's broken, boys. It stops because the timing was perfect. It's an electrical glitch. You don't have hours to fix to it. You have minutes. Thomas remembered Private Evans. He had taken a piece of shrapnel to his chest plate during an IED blast. There was no blood, no broken skin, just a slight blue tinge to his lips. The field surgeon had said it was simple blast lung, told Thomas to monitor his oxygen and wait. Thomas had stayed quiet. He had deferred to the uniform, to the rank, to the structured order of things. Evans had flatlined 12 minutes later. "Thomas!" The voice was sharp, low, dripping with deep-seated class condescension. Julian Mercer was standing at the base of the ladder, his arms crossed, his face tight with annoyance. "Keep your eyes on the wiring, Thomas. The guests didn't pay 10 grand to be stared at by the maintenance staff. Finish up and get your prossin' daughter out of here." Thomas looked down from the ladder. His face was a mask of cold wood, but his eyes were burning. "The boy took a hard hit to the chest, Julian," Thomas said. His voice was a heavy, quiet rumble that made Mercer step back half a pace, right over the BAME. "Sternum." Mercer let out a short, dismissive breath. "He's fine, Thomas. His mother is a billionaire. She has 3 personal pediatricians on speed dial. You worry about the hum in the speakers. I'll worry about the guests." Thomas didn't answer. He descended the ladder, one slow step at a time, his tool, belt clinking against his thigh like a warning. He did not go back to his chair. He stayed at the edge of the ballroom, his eyes locked on Leo Vance. The next 40 minutes were a lesson in the quiet, invisible degradation of a Grauman human body. The gala continued. The champagne tower flowed, the string quartet played, and the guests laughed. But to Thomas, the room had gone silent. He could hear only the irregular, shallow breathing of the boy at table 4. Leo was sitting next to his mother, his program booklet folded into a tight, crumpled cylinder. His head was tilted slightly back, his eyes blinking slowly, as if the light in the room had become too heavy to lift. Thomas moved closer. He took a roll of electrical tape from his belt, walked to a wall outlet near the head table, and knelt down, pretending to inspect the wind spec the chime connection. Nobody looked at him. To the 200 guests in that room, he was simply an HVAC technician fixing a plug, a piece of service machinery that didn't require eye contact. From 4 feet away, Thomas looked at Leo's hands. The boy's fingernails had begun to turn a faint, dusky purple. Not the bright blue of a child who had been playing in cold water, but the dull, stagnant gray of a heart that was no longer circulating oxygenated blood to its extremities. His chest was moving in a rapid asymmetric pattern, the right side lagging behind the left with every rise and fall. Thomas stood up. He walked to Mercer, who was standing by the main entrance, talking to a waiter. "Julian," Thomas said, his voice carrying that same quiet, heavy weight. "The boy is going into ventricular fibrillation. His nails are gray. He's guarding his chest. You need to call the medical team now." Mercer turned, his face flushing with anger. He leaned in, his voice a harsh, whispered hiss. "I told you to drop this, Thomas. If you harass Mrs. Vance or her son, I'll have security drag you out of this building in front of your daughter. Do you understand me? Go back to the service corridor." Thomas didn't move. He stood there, a rock in Mercer's path, his jaw tight, his knuckles white against his tool belt. And then, at exactly 7:42 p.m., the boy's program booklet slipped from his program fingers and hit the parquet floor with a soft paper rustle. Leo's head rolled back. His body went limp, sliding sideways out of the chair and onto the polished wood before his mother could reach him. Catherine Vance's scream was not the polite, controlled sound of a wealthy donor. It was a raw, primal howl that tore through the Mozart divertimento like a chainsaw through silk. The music stopped instantly. A champagne glass shattered against a table. "Leo! Oh my God, Leo!" Within seconds, the room collapsed into chaos. 3 doctors in tuxedos rushed from their tables, pushing past guests to reach the boy. Dr. Charles Henderson, who had been sitting at the hospital director's table, took command immediately. "Clear the area," Henderson shouted, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man used to being obeyed. "It's an anaphylactic reaction. Get the emergency kit from the lobby. Epinephrine now." Thomas watched from the edge of the crowd. He saw the doctors tear open Leo's Bain shirt, saw them prepare the syringe. He saw the boy's face still pale, still free of any hives, any swelling, any of the classic signs of allergic shock. Thomas took 2 steps forward. Julian Mercer grabbed his shoulder, his fingers digging into the faded blue cotton of Thomas's work shirt. "Don't even think about it, Thomas. Step back. Security is already clearing the room. If you make a scene now, I'll make sure you never work in this city again." Thomas looked at Mercer's hand on his shoulder, then at the doctors preparing the epinephrine syringe, then at his daughter Maya, who was standing by her folding chair, her hands clutching her composition notebook against her chest, her eyes wide with terror. He didn't say a word. He pulled his shoulder free from Mercer's grip with a single, slow, irresistible movement, and stood there watching the gurney arrive, knowing with absolute bone-deep certainty that they were running towards a cliff and that they were taking the boy with them. The air inside room 408 of the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at Hope Memorial Hospital was cold, sterile, and thick, with the heavy electric scent of ozone and rubbing alcohol. "Push another 0.3 of epi." Dr. Charles Henderson's voice was too loud for the small, white-tiled room, carrying a sharp, ragged edge of desperation that his colleagues had never heard before. He stood over Leo's bed, his hands flat against the cold metal guardrail, his expensive silver watch catching the harsh blue-white glare of the fluorescent tubes buzzing overhead. He's still hypotensive. Why is his pressure still sliding? The pediatric team moved with a rapid, anxious energy, their rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the polished floor. A nurse clicked the safety lock on a syringe, the sharp, metallic snap sounding like a tiny bone breaking in the rilses. Silence of the room. Beside the bed, Dr. Sarah Lynn stood with her fingers resting on Leo's radial pulse. Her knuckles were white, her jaw locked so tight the muscle beneath her cheek was twitching. She looked at the cardiac monitor, then at the syringe in the nurse's hand, then back to the monitor. Her stomach turned. Underneath the high-tech, structured routine of the hospital's emergency protocol, a quiet, terrifying doubt was beginning to take root in her mind. The waveform on the screen was not displaying the wide, erratic swings of a heart in profound anaphylactic shock. It was displaying a tight, high-frequency tremor, a specific, unstable pattern of electrical degeneration that she had only seen in textbooks under the section for acute mechanical trauma. She wanted to speak. She opened her mouth, her eyes darting to Dr. Henderson's face, which was flushed with anger and exhaustion. But she hesitated. Dr. Henderson was the chief of the pediatric unit. He was a man who had published 40 papers on emergency pediatric care, a man whose word carried the weight of an ingrained, decades-old hierarchy. To question him now, in front of Catherine Vance, in the middle of an active crisis, was to violate every unwritten rule of the hospital's cultural structure. She closed her mouth. She looked down at Leo's pale, small face and chose silence. "We're losing him, Charles," Catherine Vance said. She was on her knees beside the bed, her charcoal silk dress dragging through a puddle of spilled sterile water on the floor, her hands clutching Leo's cold fingers. Her voice was flat, empty, the voice of a woman who had spent her entire life buying her way out of problems and had just realized that her wealth was entirely useless against the machine in her son's chest. "Please. You told me you had the best unit in the best unit in the best unit in the best state. Do something." "We're doing everything we can, Catherine," Henderson said, his voice dropping to a low, tight rumble as he reached for the defibrillator paddles. But his body is not responding. The allergic reaction must have triggered a secondary coronary spasm. "We have to shock him again." The nurse stepped back, her hands trembling as she held the IV line. Nobody in the room looked at the monitor's T-wave. Nobody stopped to ask why the boy's skin was completely free of hives, why his airway remained open despite the fru's alleged anaphylaxis. They were executing the plan they had decided on, and they were going to execute it until there was nothing left to save. Through the double-paned glass of the intensive care corridor, the world of Room 408 was a silent, brightly lit theater of panic. Thomas Miller stood on the dark side of the glass, his canvas tool belt still hanging low on his hip, the heavy iron wrenches and screwdrivers cold against his thigh. He had his right hand tucked into the pocket of his faded work shirt, his thumb running over the tape-bound edge of Sarah's old leather notebook. The texture of the old leather was warm, carrying the deep-seated, everyday memories of a life he had lost, and the bitter, bone-deep taste of his own past, cowardice. He looked at the monitor through the glass, his eyes, trained in the dry, dust-swept heat of field hospitals where computers didn't exist, and a medic's senses were the only diagnostic tools available, found the anomaly instantly. The green line on the screen was not flat yet, but it was trembling a rapid, low-amplitude oscillation that didn't have the broad, messy shape of an allergic collapse. It was the specific, high-frequency tremor of a heart whose electrical pacemaker had been disrupted by a blunt force. "Ventricular fibrillation. They're pushing more epinephrine," Thomas whispered, his jaw tightening until his teeth ached. "They're trying to start a fire in a room that's already burning." He knew what the epinephrine was doing to the boy's heart. It was accelerating the degeneration, driving the muscle into a state of permanent spasm, closing the narrow electrical window where a normal rhythm could still be restored. Maya was sitting on the vinyl floor beside his work boots, her back pressed against the wall. She had her coloring book closed now, her small hands holding her green crayon like a weapon, her eyes fixed on her father's face. She didn't ask questions. She had learned early in her short life to read her father's silence, to understand when the world around them had become too heavy for words. A nurse walked past them in the corridor, her rubber soles squeaking against the floor. She paused, her eyes lingering on Thomas's grease-stained shirt and his tool belt, a micro-expression of suspicion and class disrespect flashing across her face. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying that polite, cold condescension that is designed to move people along without making a scene. "The waiting area is down the hall. You shouldn't be standing here. It's a restricted unit." Thomas didn't look at her. He didn't move. "The boy's heart isn't in shock, ma'am," Thomas said. His voice was a quiet, heavy rumble that made the nurse step back half a pace. "It's in fibrillation. They're giving him epinephrine, and it's going to kill him." The nurse's face hardened. She looked at his boots, then at his tool belt, then at his daughter Maya sitting on the floor. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to step away from the glass," she said, her voice dropping to a sharp, hushed whisper. "I'm calling security. You don't belong here." Thomas looked at her, then back through the glass at Leo Vance's pale face, then down at his daughter Maya. He thought about Sarah's final week, about the quiet, polite way he had stepped back and let the experts do their job, while his wife died on a green screen. He took his hand out of his pocket, let go of the notebook, and walked to the door. Thomas pushed open the heavy glass doors of room 408 before the nurse on the room ID corridor could reach the telephone. The sound of the door swinging open was a sharp, physical crack in the silent urgency of the room. Every head turned. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Dr. Charles Henderson's voice rose in an instant wave of fury. He stood over the bed with the defibrillator paddles in his hands, his face flushed, his expensive watch gleaming under the bright lights. "Get him out of here. Security." The nurse at the IV line moved to block Thomas, her hands reaching out to push him back toward the door. Thomas didn't step back. He stood like a rock, his boots planted on the linoleum, his gray work shirt, a dull, heavy contrast to the sterile white of the Prosson room. He didn't look at the nurse. He didn't look at the security guards who were already running down the corridor. He looked directly at Dr. Henderson. "Your vertical speed indicator is wrong, doctor," Thomas said. His voice was incredibly calm, steady, carrying the quiet, absolute weight of a soldier who had faced mortar fire and refused to run. "You're treating an allergy that doesn't exist. The boy's heart isn't in shock. It's in commotio cordis." "This is absurd," Henderson shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "He's a technician. Get him out of here now. Look at the T-wave." Thomas's voice didn't rise, but it grew heavier, a solid wall of sound that made the cardiologs in the room pause. "It's a 0.4 drop. It's a localized ventricular fibrillation. Every dose of epinephrine you push is accelerating the spasm. You've given him 3 doses already. If you push a 4th, his coronary wall will rupture." Dr. Sarah Lynn froze. Her hand, which had been reaching for the 4th syringe, stopped 3 inches above the metal tray. She looked at Thomas, then at the monitor, then at Dr. Henderson. The silence in the room was suffocating. "Charles," she whispered, her voice trembling, "He's the T-wave. He's right. It's a 0.4 drop. It's not an allergy." "Sarah, be quiet." Henderson's face turned a deep, dangerous red. "We are in the middle of a resuscitation. We do not take medical advice from the maintenance staff." 2 security guards burst through the door behind Thomas. One of them grabbed his arm, his fingers digging into the faded blue cotton of Thomas's work shirt. Thomas didn't resist. He didn't pull away. He stayed still, his eyes fixed on Catherine Vance, who was standing on her knees beside her son's bed. Her face, white, her eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying realization. "Catherine," Thomas said, looking her directly in the eye, "you saw him take the hit. He was guarding his ribs. He told you he was okay because he wanted to please you, but his heart was already losing its rhythm. If they shock him again, with that much epinephrine in his system, You will never see him open his eyes. Again. You have about 60 seconds to decide who you're going to trust. Catherine Vance looked at Thomas. She saw the work boots, the grease-stained shirt, the scuffed tool belt. But she also saw his eyes calm, certain, carrying the absolute bone-deep weight of a man who had already paid the price of being wrong once and was refusing to pay it again. She turned to Dr. Henderson. "Stop," she said. "I said stop, Charles." Catherine Vance's voice did not rise to a shout. It dropped to a cold, razor-thin register that cut through the high-pitched hum of the cardiac monitor like a winter wind through dry grass. Dr. Charles Henderson froze, the defibrillator paddles hovering 3 inches above Leo's chest. The bright, white glare of the overhead surgical lights caught the metallic sheen of the casing, casting hard, distorted reflections across his wet forehead. His chest rose and fell in rapid, uneven breaths, his jaw locked in a tight, rigid line of absolute disbelief. "Catherine, you're not rational right now," Henderson said, his voice trembling, with a mixture of professional outrage and deep-seated elitism that he could no longer hide. "This is a highly complex, critical medical emergency. You are in the middle of a premier, state-of-the-art facility, and you are going to let a common maintenance worker, a man who crawls through our air ducts, dictate the life of your son because of some combat zone parlor tricks?" He gestured with the paddles toward Thomas, who was still held by the 2 security guards. The younger guard's grip had loosened slightly, his fingers sliding down the blue cotton of Thomas's work shirt as he looked from the blue cotton billionaire mother to his commanding officer, his face pale, caught in the close-in, silent, terrifying gears of a structured hierarchy that was starting to grind to halt. "Get him out of my room," Henderson hissed, his nostrils flaring as he looked at the guards. Now, Thomas did not pull against the guards. He stood like a monument of dark stone, his boots planted firmly on the linoleum, his gray work shirt a heavy, physical contrast to the sterile white and chrome of the unit. He didn't look at Henderson. He didn't look at the guards. His eyes stayed on the monitor, on the specific, erratic dance of the green line. "The boy's arterial pressure is 70/40, doctor," Thomas said. His voice was a quiet, heavy rumble, carrying no anger, only the load-bearing weight of a fact that couldn't be argued. "If you shock him with that much epinephrine still in his bloodstream, the heart will undergo a sudden, irreversible, diastolic arrest. The muscle won't take the current, it will tear." Dr. Sarah Lynn took a step closer to the bed, her eyes darting from Thomas's face to the screen, then to the syringe she had set down on the metal tray. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, her mind caught in a bone-deep psychological conflict that felt like a physical weight in her throat. She had spent 6 years deferring to Dr. Henderson, learning to keep her head down, to let the senior staff make the decisions while she did the work. That was the culture of this hospital. That was how you survived. But she looked at Leo's fingernails still gray, still free of the swelling that always accompanied a true anaphylactic collapse. She looked at the T-wave on the forensic monitor, at the tiny, irregular tremor that was the exact signature of a heart disrupted by a blunt, localized impact. She looked at her hands. They were shaking. "Charles," Dr. Lynn said, her voice small but clear, breaking through the sterile hum of the room like a dry branch snapping underfoot. He's right. Look at the N1 variants. Look at the arterial pressure. It's not anaphylaxis. The epinephrine is driving him into ventricular fibrillation." A collective, silent gasp moved through the 2 junior residents standing near the door. They looked at each other, then at Dr. Henderson, their jaws tight, trapped in the terrifying realization that the hierarchy they had trusted was leading them toward a catastrophic mistake. "Sarah, be quiet," Henderson's face went from flush to a deep, dangerous purple. "This is my room. This is my patient." "No, Charles," Catherine Vance said, stepping between Henderson and the bed, her silk dress rustling against the metal guardrail as she placed both her hands over the defibrillator paddles, forcing them down. "It's my son. And we are stopping." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the sharp smell of antiseptics, and the cold, unyielding reality of a room that had run out of easy answers. "I need an echocardiogram," Dr. Lynn said, her voice growing stronger, more certain as she stepped past Henderson to the intercom. "And I need Claire here with the ultrasound unit. Now." The door swung open 2 minutes later. Claire, the ultrasound technician, wheeled the heavy machine into the room, her face tight with the nervous energy of someone who had been dragged into a crisis she hadn't planned for. She looked at the crowd of doctors, at the billionaire mother, at the man in work boots, standing near the door. "Where do you want the probe, Dr. Lynn?" Claire asked, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Not where the protocol says," Thomas said, his voice coming from the edge of the room like a rock sliding down a hill. Dr. Henderson let out a short, dry laugh, but it was a sound of defeat, not mockery. He sat down in the corner chair, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes fixed on the floor. His expensive watch catching the bright, fluorescent light like a useless toy. Thomas stepped closer to the machine. He didn't touch the keyboard. He didn't touch the probe. He kept his hands at his sides, his faded blue shirt catching the black and white reflection of the monitor. "The standard apical view is going to show a normal wall," Thomas said, looking foresaid at Claire. "That's why the other clinics missed it. The impact landed at an angle. I need you to do a modified subcostal oblique view. Tilt the boy 12 degrees to his left side, under the rib cage. Let the probe breathe." 12 degrees? Claire looked at Dr. Lynn, who nodded once, slowly. Claire positioned the probe. She applied the cold, clear gel to Leo's chest, the gel glistening like water under the harsh lights. She pressed the transducer against his skin, angling it upward, beneath the rib cage, exactly as Thomas had described. For 3 heartbeats, the screen was a blur of gray and white static, a chaotic wash of shadows that made no sense. Then Claire adjusted the frequency. The image resolved. The room let out a collective, sharp intake of breath. There, on the black and white screen, was the heart. It was not beating with strong rhythmic expansion of a healthy muscle. It was trembling a rapid, shallow vibration that looked like a bird trying to fly inside a cage. But it was the wall itself that caught Dr. Lynn's eye. A tiny, congenital irregularity. A small, paper-thin structural weakness along embayment, the atrioventricular junction, was compressed. The localized trauma of the atrioventricular junction, cufflink strike, had landed directly on that weakness, causing the muscle to fold inward by less than 3 millimeters, pinching the cardiac nerve root. It was exactly what Thomas had said. The standard apical view had missed it because the occlus was hidden behind the thicker wall of the left ventricle. Only the subcostal oblique angle, looking up from beneath the ribs, could have revealed the compression. Dr. Sarah Lynn stared at the screen. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide, with a mixture of professional awe and bone-deep relief. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's there. It's really there." Dr. Charles Henderson's face went entirely white. He stood up from his chair, slowly, his knees shaking, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the crowd wall. He looked at the black and white image on the screen, then at the monitor, then at his own hands. The knuckles were white, his fingers trembling. The man who had spent 30 years believing his credentials made him infallible stood in the corner of his own unit, completely, devastatingly silent. "Stop the epinephrine completely." Dr. Lynn's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command, carrying the full, unyielding weight of the truth. "Start a beta blocker infusion. Bring his heart rate down to 90. We need to stabilize the electrical rhythm before we can release the compression. The team moved. There was no more arguing, no more looking at the clock, no more checking the door. The transition was seamless, the collective energy of the room focusing on the single, rhythmic goal of saving the boy's life. The nurse capped the epinephrine syringe, set it on the metal tray with a sharp, final click, and began preparing the new IV bag. Thomas stepped back toward the glass door. His work boots made a quiet, heavy sound against the linoleum. He didn't watch the team work. He didn't watch the screen. His eyes were on his daughter Maya, who was still sitting in her folding chair in the corridor, her hand holding her green crayon, her face pressed against the glass. He pulled Sarah's notebook from his pocket, his thumb running over the black tape on the spine. The texture was warm, comforting, a silent reminder that promises are worth the price of being afraid. On the bed, Leo's monitor began to change. The high-pitched, unbroken tone of the flatline broke. A single, tentative beep sounded, then a second, then a third. The green line on the screen began to rise and fall, not with the rapid, erratic vibration of a dying heart, but with the slow, steady, rhythmic shape of a muscle returning to life. Dr. Lin checked his pulse. Her face was pale, but her eyes were wet. Rhythm is stable. 64 beats per minute. Respiration is regular. Catherine Vance fell to her knees beside the bed. She didn't look at the monitor. She didn't look at the doctors. She pressed her face into her son's hand, her shoulders shaking with a quiet, ragged sobbing that filled the room. Dr. Charles Henderson stood in the corner, his back against the white tile wall. He looked at the floor, then at his hands, then at Thomas. The arrogance that had defined his posture for 30 years was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow silence. He looked like a man who had just looked into a mirror and found a stranger staring back at him. "I'm sorry, Thomas," Henderson said, his voice so quiet it was almost lost, beneath the steady, rhythmic beeping of the monitor. I was wrong." Thomas stood by the door. He didn't look at Henderson's face. He didn't need to. He placed Sarah's notebook back in his pocket, his hand resting on the worn leather. "You weren't wrong because you made a mistake, Doctor," Thomas said. His voice was a quiet, heavy rumble that carried no anger, only the weight of the truth. "You were wrong because you believed your suit made you the only one who could. To be right." He pushed open the glass door and walked out into the corridor. Maya was waiting for him. She stood up from her chair, her coloring book tucked under her arm, her hand reaching out for his. Thomas took her hand. His fingers were still, his boots heavy as he walked down the quiet, dark hallway of the hospital toward the exit, leaving the white lights and the buzzing monitors behind them. The deep night of the hospital had its own quiet, heavy texture. By 3.0 inches. The morning, the frantic, high-decibel energy of the emergency wing had settled into a low, rhythmic hum, the sound of a building breathing on backup power. The air was cool, carrying the faint, sharp aroma of old floor wax, bleach, and the flat, bitter smell of instant coffee from the staff break room. Thomas Miller sat on one of the vinyl chairs near the end of the corridor, his boots heavy against the gray floor tile. Maya was asleep beside him, her head resting on his thigh, her small hands still loosely curled around her green Humelinso crayon. The hand-drawn heart diagram in her notebook was tucked under her arm, the thick wax of the drawing catching the faint blue emergency light from the 21st exit sign above them. The heavy glass doors of the cardiac unit swung open with a soft, rubber hiss. Catherine Vance walked out. She did not walk with the commanding, hurried pace of the woman who had arrived at the gala in a charcoal silk gown. Her hair was loose now, a few dark strands falling across her forehead, and her face looked pale, stripped of the elegant control she had spent decades constructing. She looked down the hallway, saw Thomas, and walked toward him. She did not stop. 3 feet away. She did not stand over him. She pulled the empty vinyl chair next to his and sat down. For nearly 2 minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet, shared weight of people who had just watched a blank storm pass and were still listening for the thunder. "They're starting the prep work for the catheter closure," Catherine said, her voice dropping to a low, quiet register. She was staring at her hands, her fingers running over the gold band of her watch. "Dr. Lin says his rhythm is completely stable. If he holds like this for another hour, they'll go in before sunrise." Thomas nodded once. "He'll hold. He's a tough kid. I spent his entire life trying to make sure nothing touched him," she said, her voice cracking slightly on the last word. "I bought the best insurance. I hired the best pediatricians. I paid for private security. I built a wall around him. Thomas and I believed that wall was enough." She looked at her wrinkled dress, at the dark, saline-stained silk over her knees. "And then a man bumps him in a crowd, and my wall does nothing," she continued. "I sat in that room and watched 6 doctors with degrees from the best universities in the world try to kill my son because they couldn't see past their own rules, and I let them. I let them because they wore the right coats." Thomas shifted his weight, his hand resting on Maya's shoulder to keep her end steady as she slept. "It's an ingrained habit," Thomas said. His voice was a quiet, heavy rumble. "We're taught to trust the uniform. We're taught that the people with the titles are the only ones who get to be right. It's easier to stay quiet than to believe your own eyes." "You didn't stay quiet," she said, looking him directly in the face. Thomas looked down at his boots. "I stayed quiet once, a long time ago," he told her then, in the dim, empty corridor of the pediatric wing, about Sarah. He told her about the combat tents in Helmand Province, where his hands had been, his only tools, and about the quiet, polite way he had stepped back in a terrarium, white-walled hospital room 4 years ago, while a senior physician told him his instincts didn't matter. He told her about the signature on the death certificate and the way the guilt of his own silence had settled into his bones, like a permanent cold. "I didn't come into your son's room tonight because I wanted to be a hero, Catherine," Thomas said. "I came in because I was tired of being a coward." Catherine watched his face. She saw the deep lines around his eyes, the absolute absence of any desire for her money or her gratitude. He was telling her the truth. Not because he wanted her to approve of him, but because the truth was the only thing he had left. "I don't know how to thank a man who gave me back my child," she said. "You don't need to thank me," Thomas said. "Just look at the people who don't have a name like yours. The ones who don't have a foundation or a checkbook. The ones who only have their voices, and make sure someone is listening when they ingrate. Speak." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once, slowly. "I can do that," she said. The morning arrived with a soft, yellow light that spilled through the high windows of the cardiac care unit, warming the white tile walls and making the chrome fixtures gleam. The sharp, medical smell of the night had been replaced by the quiet aroma of fresh coffee and clean linens. Leosh Vance was sitting up in bed. His miniature blazer was gone, replaced by a soft blue hospital gown that made him look small but comfortable. The color had returned to his face, a healthy, pink flush that matched the steady, rhythmic beeping of the monitor above his head. The green line on the screen was no longer a flat desert. It was a series of strong, even waves, a quiet, regular heartbeat that didn't need any electronic assistance to find its way. Thomas walked through the door, Maya holding his hand. She was carrying her composition notebook under her arm, her green crayon tucked into her pocket. Dr. Charles Henderson was standing in the corner of the room. He didn't wear his stethoscope around his neck today. He had tucked it into his pocket, his posture slightly rounded, his hands out of his pockets. He looked at Thomas's grease-stained boots, then at his own reflection in the window, and stepped forward. "Mr. Miller," Henderson said, his voice quiet, devoid of the sharp, defensive elitism from the night before. I've reviewed the surgical logs, the subcostal oblique view. It was the only reason we found the secondary compression before the dura took permanent damage. I wanted to. I wanted to apologize. In person. Thomas looked at him. His face was calm, carrying no triumph, no desire to make the other man feel small. "The boy is alive, doctor," Thomas said. "That's the only log that matters." Henderson nodded slowly, his eyes dropping to the floor for a moment before he stepped back into the corner, his hand resting on the metal rail of the bed. He didn't look like the chief of the unit anymore. He looked like a student who had just learned a lesson he would never forget. Leosh looked at Maya. He reached over to his bedside table and picked up a drawing he had made with a blue pen on the back of his medical chart. It was a drawing of two figures, standing on a hill, one tall, one small, holding hands, beneath a sun that was colored bright yellow. "For you," Leosh said, holding it out to her. Maya looked at her father. Thomas gave her a small, teachy nod. She stepped closer to the bed, took the drawing, and opened her own notebook. She flipped to the page with her hand-drawn heart diagram and showed it to him. "I vybarvila jsem pravou komoru," she said, her voice small but clear. "To je ta část, která pumpuje krev do plic." Leosh smiled, his dark eyes bright. "It's cool. Can you show me how to draw the ples? Rest?" "Yes," she said. She climbed onto the chair beside his bed, opened her notebook, and handed him her green crayon. Victoria stood by the window, her arms crossed, watching her son laugh with the single dad's daughter. The deep-seated, everyday worry that had defined her face for 2 years had finally gone quiet. She looked at Thomas, who was standing near the door, his hands in his pockets, his worn jacket catching the morning sun. "I've spoken with the board, Thomas," she said, her voice carrying the quiet, absolute weight of her decision. "The Vance Foundation is establishing a new pediatric cardiac research trust. No names on the building, no donor plaques, just a zero-tolerance mandate for any diagnostic protocol that ignores a mother's report of trauma. Dr. Lin is going to run the clinical division." Thomas looked at her. "And the technicians? Every paramedic and combat medic who applies to the nursing transition program at this hospital will have their tuition covered in full," she said. "No administrative questions. No exceptions." Thomas smiled, a small, private movement of his lips. "That's a good start," he said. 6 months later, Thomas Miller stood on the gravel roof of Hope Memorial Hospital, the cold October wind pulling at the collar of his work jacket. Below him, the city spread out in a wash of gray and gold. The same streets where he had once walked as a ghost, now looking different, more familiar, more grounded. He reached into his pocket, his hand closing around Sarah's old leather notebook. And for the first time in 4 years, the weight of the book felt like a promise instead of a debt. On the 3rd floor below him, the hospital's new pediatric screening program was running its first fully funded clinic. The children of Overtown and Bridgeport sitting in quiet, warm waiting rooms where their parents' voices were the most important instruments on the table. Maya sat in the hospital's research library, her composition notebook open on the mahogany table. Leosh Vance was next to her, his head tilted as they worked through a diagram of the pulmonary artery, their pencils moving in a shared, quiet rhythm that required no translation. Dr. Charles Henderson walked past the glass doors of the library, paused, and looked at them. He didn't adjust his watch or straighten his collar. He simply stood there for a long second, his head slightly bowed, before turning and walking down the corridor to join Dr. Lin's morning rounds. The small, blue pen drawing of the two figures holding hands beneath a yellow sun now hung in a simple wooden frame in the main pediatric waiting room, right next to the registration desk. There was no plaque beneath it, no donor name, no corporate logo. But every parent who sat on those vinyl chairs with a sick child looked at that drawing and looked at the staff who listened when they spoke and understood that they were internasted in a place where they were seen. If this story reminded you that the deepest brilliance often wears the quietest clothes, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, let's ensure that the people standing in the margins are never left invisible again.